How do we define nature? This question exemplifies one of the key goals of philosophical thought, considering large and abstract concepts and determining how to define them. The question of defining nature has been the thematic focus of our course, so to hopefully further this goal, our team has chosen to explore an interesting case study that could aid in finding the outer extent of the concept of nature, and by doing so, aid in our understanding of what nature truly is. So without further ado, let us begin our exploration of the question, is outer space nature? This question will be approached in three different manners: the subjective perspective, the objective perspective, and the political or relative perspective. And as you will soon see, the perspective one chooses to view this inquiry from, and the relative weight it is assigned, will play a major part in the way the question is answered. Many points within each category will conclude with questions. These questions are rhetorical in nature and purposefully left unanswered, as the emphasis of this project is not upon answering the question, but the logic and analysis that leads us to them. There will, however, be a conclusion at the end of the video where I will be postulating the team's collective opinions and comments, but until then, we begin with the subjective perspective. Subjective in this instance refers to any approach to answering the key question of is space nature, derived purely from an individual's personal experiences, emotions, or beliefs. For example, in our team's initial discussions on the key question, one observation was that outer space did not feel like a part of nature in the eyes of some of the group members. The imagery associated with space in their minds was vast and powerful, and in that regard similar to nature, but also cold, empty, black or blue or purple in aura and coloration, and fittingly, spacious. The imagery associated with the word nature, on the other hand, was warmer, more dynamic, full of life, green and yellow and sky blue in aura, and much more present as opposed to the sense of distance given off from space. Furthermore, it was observed that in everyday conversation, the word nature wasn't frequently used to apply to space. A nature walk and a spacewalk are two entirely separate activities, and although perhaps this phenomenon of terminology use could be chalked up to the simple semantics of language, when seeking to define a term, the context in which the term is used is definitely something to be considered. Our final subjective exploration is that of the relationships humans can hold to the subjects of nature and space. Depending on one's individual beliefs, this relationship may differ from person to person. However, it seems as though, despite this, there are few archetypal relationships that are shared amongst most people in regards to both space and nature. The relationship may be one of components, in which humans are viewed as being a part or a component of nature, as well as part of the universe. Another is parental, where nature or space is viewed as having created humanity, the world, and thus the individual. This relationship to nature being epitomized in the phrase Mother Earth, or for space as being created from stardust, and is frequently accompanied by some degree of spiritual reverence. Or, as yet another alternative, there could exist a relationship of commodification, where the individual views both space and nature as being simply physical realms of no significance beyond that of a utilizable resource. Do then the commonality and application of these statements of human relationship to the two subjects of space and nature suggest some sort of unity between them? Or are these seemingly archetypal forms of subjective relationship applicable to all abstract, larger realms of creation and human beings, and can be applied to any sort of term referencing a realm, such as the Earth, the solar system, or creation? Now, while the depths of subjective perception are intriguing, and the subject of entire fields of philosophy, personal views and experiences are obviously modeled upon an individual's unique circumstance, and while we would love to foray into the depths of individual belief and phenomenology, we would quickly lose our focus upon the answering of the key question, so we must unfortunately limit ourselves. With that, since in our pursuit of answering is space nature, we are not asking an opinion, but are pursuing a more universally acceptable articulation of the relationship with an emphasis on defining, perhaps a more impartial approach would yield more clarity and information. This brings us to the second category of exploratory thought, the objective perspective. This dimension of thought is in reference to observations whose logic and persuasive ability lie within how certain characteristics are either shared or unshared between space and nature. Or, to simply put it in a question, what objective, scientifically verifiable claims can be made that apply to both space and realms traditionally considered nature? Or, in what verifiable aspects do they differ? One of the most immediately distinguishing characteristics between space and planet Earth is that of the presence of life. It is scientifically verifiable that outer space has no life. Earth, however, does, and interestingly, some of the richest regions of biotic activity on the planet are almost universally determined to fall underneath the umbrella of nature. Jungles, forests, and coral reefs, these distinctly terrestrial entities are virtually universally regarded as components of, or at a bare minimum, places where nature continues to exist. The question that then arises is one in reference to life and whether it could potentially be a determining factor of whether or not a location possesses or is within nature. Or, to again rephrase the statement as a question, is biotic activity in some capacity a necessary component of nature? And since then space is devoid of life, does that mean that space is not nature? This is a point that was debated quite intensely in the construction of this project, as the immediate counter-argument to life being a requirement of nature is the pointing to examples of regions sparse of life upon planet Earth that some would still consider nature. Deserts, mountains, and glaciers. Do these areas less teeming with life not still qualify as either being within or containing nature? A fair critique, certainly, but one far from flawless, as certain group members were quick to point out. For, firstly, there is in fact life everywhere on planet Earth on the microbial level, thus, these sparser regions are not as barren of life as perhaps being implied. Furthermore, to quickly return back to a previously mentioned subjective point, in the act of imagining these seemingly desolate realms, do they not seem more akin in essence and aura to that of space? Does the mental image of a glacier not share more an overall subjective emotional vibe to that of a galaxy or a comet when compared to other firmly natural realms such as the jungle? With all that in mind, I ask the viewer to consider, how does life play into the key question? Bringing humans back into the equation, are there any objectively definable characteristics of the human-space or human-nature relationship, the term relationship in this instance referring to less philosophical and more objective, tangible relationships, and how do they compare and contrast? One obvious difference in the relationships is that humans cannot survive in space naked, while they can survive in some traditionally natural regions like forests. Or, to bring up yet another objective statement, is it not true that the ecological impact that humans have had on accepted regions of nature like jungles is significantly greater than that inflicted upon outer space? We've destroyed no planets or stars, yet many soybean fields rest on what was once rainforest. How does this factor into our key question? Do these clear-cut, irrefutable facts in human space and human nature relations imply the necessity of a terminological difference between the two? With that, then, we come to our final dimension of discussion, the political, historical, relative perspective. This section will consist of comparisons and contrasts between various historical events and policies regarding nature to the contemporary conditions and policies regarding space. The reason this is a separate category from the objective classification is that, unlike the statements humans die in space, a statement of very little controversy that requires virtually no extrapolation or context, the statements in this category often will rely much more upon hypothetical situations and prediction, which, in the eyes of some more skeptical viewers who perhaps view history as not having any sort of predictive value or cyclical nature, may be seen as derived or rather forced comparisons. This category also differs from that of the subjective explorations of human relationships, as while that section was our attempt to categorize common instances of how individuals view their relationship to the subjects of space and nature, the instances we will be discussing in this section will be the product, and only the product, of societies and collective agreement on actions and inactions in regards to their respective frontiers. With that, then, let us begin by discussing the concept of the frontier. The frontier in the American cultural tradition is the concept of an extending borderline between the civilized human world and the natural world. The frontier held both positive and negative connotations in the era of its domination. Some viewed it as the wall between civilization and the vast chaotic depths of the untamed world, or alternatively as the quickly diminishing border between the last bastion of natural freedom and the oppressive cramped societal realm. Space, then, is in itself a frontier, in that it is, much like the frontier for the Anglo-Americans, the borderline in which few humans ventured into, and little to no familiar forms of settlement existed. It is wild, unclaimed, and dangerous, and as such, shares the disparity and connotation of that of the natural frontier. Space is either a lifeless void or humanity's inevitable destiny. But this phenomenon of the frontier is not our topic of inquiry for this section. It is only the launching point for a further investigation not into the subjective relationship of the collective towards the frontier, but the political policy and collectively adopted actions towards it. For instance, it is common knowledge now that America ended up taming the West, but to those living in the time of this expansion, it was not inevitable and, depending how far back in time you go, even desired. The British, while still the colonial rulers of the 13 colonies, in fact established a doctrine preventing the westward expansion of colonists beyond the Appalachians known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. The reason for the establishment of these limitations of pushing of the frontier was diplomatic in nature, as the Proclamation Line sought to prevent territorial disputes with the natives and French, who were all competing with one another at the time. Compare this to a much more contemporary document, one whose policy still currently stands as the official agreement regarding extraterrestrial territory and real estate, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is a document limiting military presence, commercial exploitation, and territorial claims on any area of space or celestial body. The document was drafted in an era of American-Soviet competition for diplomatic purposes. A New Frontier, a limiting political document with diplomatic motivations produced out of competition between world powers, one cannot help but see the similarities. Our team would posit then that space is simply the next frontier and will soon be expanded out into in the same manner the Anglo-Americans did eventually cross the Proclamation Line and seize the remainder of the continent. And if SpaceX, Space Force, technology companies' satellite presence, or any of the various space-based industries or organizations are something to go off of, then it appears that this preventative policy is on the verge of disregard. Is this, then, the commonality of frontier, the shared fate of colonization and exploitation in the interest of developing commerce and satiating human ambition, the ultimate, perhaps unsettling testament to the unity of space and nature? Or is it a statement of fundamental difference in that space, unlike the nature of the American West, will never be able to fall to the influence of human hands? One can only speculate, and only time will tell. So what then is to be gleaned from this collection of comparisons and contrasts? Fundamentally, of course, it is you, the viewer's decision to determine your own position and definition, but we, as the developers of this project, did, in our research, draw some conclusions of our own and come to develop what we believe to be an effective answer to the question of, is space nature? We have come to believe that space, though sharing similar attributes in some instances, is in essence the frontier of nature. Nature exists not as a definitive dual state of presence or non-presence, but as a spectrum, founded largely upon biotic activity, with the vacuum of space existing on one end and the densest region of jungle lying on the other. Space not only subjectively feels different to the most natural of regions, but it is objectively hostile to and devoid of life. Furthermore, while the political similarities are something to be said for the concept of the frontier and present a story of caution in how we move forward with our forays into outer space, a shared quality is not the same as a shared entity. Space and nature are both frontiers, and nature is a location within space, but just as how Toledo, Ohio is not the same thing as Ohio, nature is distinct both in its biotic activity and more subjective aesthetic form. With this model, then, of nature being a sliding categorization following the rate of biological activity, one group member brought up an interesting question. How would this apply to extraterrestrial forms of life? Would planets with biodiverse habitats then be natural? We deliberated and eventually came to an agreement of yes, it is our opinion that nature rises and fades across the universe and is found more in dense regions of biological activity. Thus, if a jungle on a different planet exists, but is still characterized by complex ecological and biotic forms of activity, then the planet is, perhaps a different form of, but still, nature. One final comment, then, is keeping in mind the spectrum model of nature that, though we have emphasized life, nature is not purely confined to the biotic. There are, in fact, dynamic entities that demonstrate more natural qualities than that of stagnant, non-active regions that can be considered nature. For instance, the Sun and tectonically active planets we could categorize as being more natural than the void of space. This being based upon the aforementioned difference in vibe from the subjective section. But with our theories of space and its relationship to nature out of the way, we conclude with a final point of consideration. Though nature and space may not be unified in their categorization, the only reason they are or are not is because we, humans, unique amongst all other forms, living or non-living, have the power to say so. We all lie much higher in the scale of naturalness to that of unliving stone or the vacuum of space, and perhaps this is the most important thing to remember. No matter where we are from or what we have seen or done, we are all humans, unified by our presence in this oasis of a world so defined and sculpted by nature, and thus should treat one another as what we are, allies and cousins, gazing collectively to the stars, deliberating upon the nature of the universe.